Do you plan to return him?
Well, I'm supposed to have suggested that I smuggle terrorists into the United States, right?
It's always how
can I return him to the United States? Like, I smuggle him into the United States, or what do I do? Of course, I'm not going to do it. It's like, the question is preposterous. How can I smuggle a terrorist into the United States? I don't have the power to return him to the United States.
But you could release him inside El Salvador.
Yeah, but I'm not releasing. We're not very fond of releasing terrorists into our country. We just turned the murder capital of the world into the safest country of the Western Hemisphere, and you want us to go back into releasing criminals so we can go back to being the murder capital of the world? No, that's not going to happen.
They'd love to have a criminal, released into our
country. There's a fascination.
They would love it.
Yeah.
They're sick. These are sick people.
The quote-unquote terrorist that they were referring to there is Kilmar Armando Garcia, and he's not a terrorist. He is an innocent man who's a father of 3 and a husband from Maryland with no criminal record, yet he was sent to a gulag in El Salvador by mistake. The Trump administration called his deportation an administrative error and even acknowledged that he was protected from deportation because of a 2019 court order. So, no, Abrego Garcia is not a terrorist, and the president of El Salvador, Bukele, who you heard from there, can easily release him like that if he wanted to, and Trump can simply look over and tell him, hey, release him, and he would comply. But neither of these men want to release him, even though they admitted that he ended up in a gulag because of their fuck-up. But on April 10th, in a unanimous Supreme Court decision, they upheld a lower court's ruling that ordered the Trump administration to bring him back, writing, the lower court's order properly requires the government to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador and to ensure that his case is handled as it would have been handled had he not been improperly sent to El Salvador. The intended scope of the term effectuate in the district court's order is, however, unclear and may exceed the district court's authority. The district court should clarify its directive with due regard for the deference owed to the executive branch in the conduct of foreign affairs. For its part, the government should be prepared to share what it can concerning the steps it has taken and the prospect of further steps. In other words, the Supreme Court is saying that the lower court was right to order the government to facilitate his release since his deportation was illegal, and the Trump administration should explain the steps that they're taking to do just that. Now, if they still want to deport him, technically they can do that, but they're required to do it the right way and give him due process. However, the Supreme Court also says that the lower court needs to explain what it meant by effectuate, since the court can't tell the executive branch how to get a foreign government to do something because courts don't have jurisdiction over foreign policy, and Abrego Garcia's attorney explained what that meant in simple terms.
The decision confirms that the government needs to facilitate, but asks the lower court to clarify what it meant when it said that the U.S. government should effectuate. And that's just a reference to the limits of the U.S. government's power to control the actions of a foreign sovereign here, El Salvador. So it may take some time. The bottom line is that it may take some time because, of course, the U.S. government cannot order another government to do anything now that it has put Mr. Abrego Garcia in this position. But it is still a step in the right direction and hopefully will lead to his return home to his family, or at least, unfortunately, to immigration detention in the United States while the government works out its theory for why he should be removed, even though he received legal protection in the past.
So a court can tell the Trump administration to do something, but can't tell them how to do it. But the lower court judge, who the Supreme Court agreed with, by the way, issued a new order clarifying her requirements as requested by the Supreme Court. And NPR explains Judge Zinnes issued a new order directing the federal government to take all available steps to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia to the United States as soon as possible. And she ordered the Justice Department to provide an immediate update on his location and status, what steps the government has taken so far to bring him back, and what additional steps it is considering. Now, in her previous order, she specifically said that the Trump administration should facilitate and effectuate the return of Abrego Garcia, but after the Supreme Court weighed in and said that effectuate wasn't clear enough, she clarified, and she leaned in on that word facilitate and said that she's basically now ordering the Trump administration to bring him back, but she's not saying how they have to bring him back, but she is requiring them to tell her what they're doing to facilitate his return, which is something that she can do as confirmed by the Supreme Court. Now, if it feels like I'm being unnecessarily technical or meticulous, I am, but the context is necessary so you can understand just how egregious the Trump administration's lies are in defying these orders. The excuses that they make are completely bogus. Now, to be clear, a judge asking an administration to provide them, to provide her in particular, with regard to Judge Zinnes, information about how they're going to comply with her order is not an unreasonable ask. It's very simple, as explained by law professor James Sample, but they are still refusing to comply with even the bare minimum.
We're asking so little. She is asking so little of the government, and they are still...
With the unanimous backing of the Supreme Court of the United States.
Absolutely. And in fact, not just 9 justices of the Supreme Court, but all 13 federal judges who have looked at this matter have ruled in the exact same way, rejecting the government's fundamental proposition here, which is the government's fundamental proposition is, yeah, we made a mistake. So what? Tough luck. On to the next. All 13 judges, including the district court judge, Paul Zinnes, including 3 judges on the Fourth Circuit, and all 9 justices of the Supreme Court reject the government's position, and yet the government is still resisting, even as to that little modicum of information that you mentioned.
So in layman's terms, the judge, with the full backing of the Supreme Court, mind you, is ordering them to bring him back and asking what they're doing to comply with her order to bring him back, and their answer is basically, fuck you. That's not specifically verbatim what they said, but in not so many words, they're making it clear that they're not going to comply. The only piece of information that they gave to this judge was that he's alive. Everything else is privileged, according to them. And she responded in court saying, I'm not asking for state secrets. I'm asking you to explain to me what you are doing to comply with my order to bring him back after I said you must bring him back. But we're getting nothing. They still won't disclose his location or elaborate on any meaningful steps that they're taking to bring him back, or if they're even planning to bring him back at all. And thanks to that joint meeting in the Oval Office between Bukele and Trump, we now know definitively that they're refusing to comply with this judge's order and now with the Supreme Court because they have no plans to bring him back. In fact, they're telling the press that the Supreme Court ruling was actually a victory for them, not for Abrego Garcia. And CNN's Caitlin Collins asked Trump whether or not he's going to ask Bukele to return him, since he's right there and facilitating his return would be super easy right now. Convenient, right? So he doesn't answer. Instead, he pivots to Pam Bondi, who comes up with multiple lies in the span of just a couple of seconds. And this is a lot, but we'll break it down when we come back.
Do you plan to ask President Bukele to help return the man who your administration says was mistakenly deported? The man who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador?
Well, let me ask Pam, would you answer that question?
Sure, President. First and foremost, he was illegally in our country. He had been illegally in our country. And in 2019, 2 courts, an immigration court and an appellate immigration court, ruled that he was a member of MS-13 and he was illegally in our country. Right now, it was additional paperwork had needed to be done. That's up to El Salvador if they want to return him. That's not up to us. The Supreme Court ruled, President, that if, as El Salvador wants to return him, this is international matters, foreign affairs, if they wanted to return him, we would facilitate it, meaning provide a plane.
Okay, first of all, even though he entered the country illegally, he won legal status in a court because they believed that he'd face persecution if he returned to El Salvador. Second of all, the claim that he was a member of MS-13 is a straight-up lie. As Aaron Reich-Lin-Melnick of the American Immigration Council explains, these were unproven allegations made during bond proceedings for him that the government wasn't required to prove. Allegations made, by the way, by ICE, not the most trustworthy agency. Furthermore, he doesn't have a criminal record. He has no MS-13 gang tattoos to confirm his affiliation, and his wife, who's a U.S. citizen, emphatically denies that he is affiliated with any gang.
It was an administrative error as to why he was deported, and he is a known gang member. ICE testified he was a gang member, and we believe he should stay where he is.
Jennifer, what do you say to these accusations that you just heard from the Attorney General that your husband is a known gang member?
They're wrong because my husband is not a gang member. He's actually an amazing father, an amazing husband. That's who he truly is.
And the sad irony is that he fled El Salvador because of gang violence. a judge in 2019 at least temporarily said he can't be deported because he is at risk of persecution if he goes back to El Salvador. But here's the thing. If Pam Bondi actually had evidence that he was in a gang, well, then it'd be super easy to prove that in the court of law. But the fact that they're refusing to give him or anyone else sent to this gulag due process tells you that they're not too confident in their claims. And that's because their claims are bullshit. It's because they're lying. 60 Minutes couldn't find criminal records for 75% of the 238 men sent to CECOT, meaning that 179 of them are probably going to rot in that gulag for the rest of their lives, even though they are completely innocent. So they are lying about these people. But going back to Bondi's claim about facilitating his return, she suggests that that just means that they have to provide El Salvador with the plane, but they can't compel Bukele to comply. Now, that's not just an oversimplification. It is a brazen fucking lie. The president of the United States is not powerless in this situation. Neither is the president of El Salvador, who has jurisdiction over that prison. See, if Trump demands the return of Abrego Garcia, Bukele will comply. But they're making the choice to not bring him back, and that's why they're refusing to comply. And they're defying the courts, even though Trump said he wouldn't defy the courts, which isn't necessarily surprising since he lies all the time. But just listen to his Orwellian answer when he was asked about this.
Well, Mr. President, you said that if the Supreme Court said someone needed to be returned, that you would abide by that. You said that on Air Force One just a few days ago. And they said that it must be facilitated.
Why don't you just say, isn't it wonderful that we're keeping criminals out of our country? Why can't you just say that? Why do you go over and over? And that's why nobody watches you anymore. You know, you have no credibility. Please, go ahead.
President Trump.
Because he's not a fucking criminal. He's innocent. But Trump is basically saying, look, why won't you just believe whatever bullshit we tell you? We say he's a criminal and that's that. End of story. Accept our version of reality and never question it. And their version of reality, by the way, suggests that the Supreme Court sided unanimously in Trump's favor, not in Abrego Garcia's favor, even though if you read the 4-page document, it's very clear that that is not the case. But just listen, because this is wild to me.
And what was the ruling in the Supreme Court, Steve? Was it 9-0?
Yes, it was a 9-0.
In our favor?
In our favor, against the district court ruling, saying that no district court has the power to compel the foreign policy function of the United States. As Pam said, the ruling solely stated that if this individual at El Salvador's sole discretion was sent back to our country, that we could deport him a second time.
Well,
no version of this legally ends up with him ever living here because he is a citizen of El Salvador. That is the president of El Salvador. Your questions about it per the court can only be directed to him.
That is a level of spin that is astonishing, even for this administration. Listen, the Supreme Court ruling is 4 pages long, as I mentioned earlier. I will link to that down below if you want to read it in its entirety. It'll take you less than 5 minutes. It's very clear. You don't need a law degree or know about constitutional law to understand what they're saying. They said that a lower court can't dictate how you do it, but you do have to facilitate Abrego Garcia's return since he was deported illegally. And it's true that you could technically bring him back and deport him again. They do leave that possibility there, but they emphasize that he must be given due process, which he was not given when he was sent on a plane and sent to this gulag. And since he was denied due process in the first place, that is the reason why you have to facilitate his return, because you deported him in defiance of a court order protecting him from deportation, which demonstrates why due process is so goddamn important. But this is why Trump is deporting people under the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, because he thinks that it gives him permission to deny people due process in the same way that you would deny people due process in a time of war when martial law is declared. And even though the Supreme Court is stupidly allowing Trump to do that, they're still saying that you have to give people notice at a minimum, which obviously is impossible in practice since they don't have time or money to contest these rapid deportations. But they're at least trying to pretend like we still have due process and maintain the facade that there is law and order in this country. But in the case of Abrego Garcia, the violation of his due process was so egregious that all 9 Supreme Court justices, including Alito and Thomas, said, yeah, actually, this was a fuck up. He was legally protected from deportation and you deported him and now you won't bring him back. When you get Clarence Thomas and Alito to agree that Trump went too far, that's an indication that he went too far. But Trump's administration is trying to muddy the waters by pretending like the Supreme Court vindicated them in order to obscure the reality that they are brazenly violating court orders. I mean, it's not the first one that they violated, and it's not going to be the last. And at that same press meeting, by the way, Trump broadcasted his intent to take us down an even more dangerous path.
You mentioned that you're open to deporting individuals that aren't foreign aliens, but are criminals, to El Salvador. Does that include potentially U.S. citizens, fully naturalized Americans?
If they're criminals and if they hit people with baseball bats over their head that happen to be 90 years old, and if they rape 87-year-old women in Coney Island, Brooklyn, yeah, that includes them. What, do you think there's a special category of person? They're as bad as anybody that comes in. We have bad ones too. And I'm all for it because we can do things with the president for less money and have great security. And we have a huge prison population. We have a huge number of prisons, and then we have the private prisons, and some are operated well, I guess, and some aren't. But he does a great job with that. We have others that we're negotiating with too. But no, if it's a homegrown criminal, I have no problem. Now, we're studying the laws right now. Pam is studying. If we can do that, that's good. And I'm talking about violent people. I'm talking about really bad people. Really bad people. Every bit as bad as the ones coming in.
Well, of course, you'd only send the bad ones to foreign gulags. Totally believable. Listen, he is deporting permanent residents like Mahmoud Khalil for being pro-Palestine. But he expects us to believe that only the most hardened criminals would be sent to foreign gulags. Listen, even if that were true, it would be completely unconstitutional. But if you believe that he's only going to target the criminals, I got a bridge to sell you, because he said that about immigrants, and we're seeing so many innocent people be sent to foreign gulags. So why would the same be true about American citizens? He's not just going to suddenly be a little bit more scrupulous in sending Americans there because they're American citizens. He doesn't give a shit about the Constitution, so nobody should believe him. And as Mark Joseph Stern put it in an article for Slate, calling this a constitutional crisis undersells the catastrophic implications of this emergency. This administration is rapidly constructing a legal framework that would allow it to abruptly disappear anyone, including natural-born U.S. citizens, to a foreign prison forever for any reason it chooses, or no reason at all. And on that note, we got audio of something Trump told Bukele, and I don't know why the video is so bad, but the audio speaks for itself. Just listen.
Yeah, I said, homegrowns are next. The homegrowns built. You got to build about 5 more places.
Yeah, that's fair.
All right. It's not big enough.
No, yeah,
come on.
Yeah, needless to say, that is alarming. Now, what's even more alarming is that Trump is cozying up to Bukele in the first place, who became a dictator by using the exact same playbook Trump is using right now. Per Freedom House, Bukele overstayed constitutional term limits for presidents and ran again and supposedly won with 85% of the vote in a flawed election. He passed electoral reforms that benefited his fascist party, and he consolidated power by declaring a state of emergency back in 2022 that, quote, led to the arbitrary arrest of more than 83,000 Salvadorians, harassment and violence against government critics and journalists, and mass firings of public servants, resulting in a deterioration in freedom of expression and rule of law in the country. Sound familiar? Trump is currently considering an unconstitutional third run for the presidency, and he is signing executive orders letting the federal government, and specifically DOJ, take power away from state and local governments when it comes to elections. Meanwhile, Republicans, and 4 Democrats, by the way, passed the SAVE Act, which is a voter suppression law that could disenfranchise millions of married women. On top of that, Trump is cracking down on free speech more than any other president in modern history. He's banning government agencies from using DEI words like equity or inclusion, and he's been disappearing foreign students for criticizing Israel. He just called on his FCC chair to punish CBS for doing journalism that he disapproves of. And look, it's not as bad as Bukele yet. He presumably hasn't jailed 83,000 people, at least that we're aware of. But it won't be long until he surpasses Bukele at the rate that he's going. And like Bukele, he's denying immigrants due process and trying to come up with the most efficient deportation system imaginable. Kind of like Amazon Prime, but with humans, as border czar Tom Homan put it, which is a crazy-ass thing to say. And that includes creative new ways to get tax-paying, law-abiding immigrants to self-deport, like by declaring them dead so they lose access to to their credit cards and bank accounts, as the New York Times reports. So it makes sense why Trump and Bukele get along so well, because they're pretty similar. And neither of them have an interest in letting anyone ever leave CECOT because, as Adam Serwer put it in The Atlantic, if Abrego Garcia returns, he could speak out about the conditions he experienced at the facility, which could have political consequences both for the Salvadorian leadership and for the Trump administration. And that makes sense. I mean, you wouldn't send them to a foreign gulag if you didn't want to torture them, because if you send them to an ICE detention center in Louisiana, for example, you're going to have American journalists snooping around. But if you send them far away to this remote area in a foreign country that's inaccessible to journalists, of course, you can basically do whatever you want to them. You can send whoever you want there with minimal scrutiny, because it's going to be very difficult to get people there to report on the human rights abuses that are taking place. And Bukele was explaining this to Trump and basically cheering him on, saying, yeah, man, you're on the right track. That's not his words, but just listen.
And in fact, Mr. President, you have 350 million people to liberate. Yes. But to liberate 350 million people, you have to imprison some. That's the way it works, right? You cannot just, free the criminals and think crime is going to go down magically. You have to imprison them so you can liberate 350 million Americans that are asking for the end of crime and the end of terrorism. And it can be done. I mean, you're doing it already.
Great advice to a wannabe dictator from a literal dictator. So even though immigrants are currently bearing the brunt of this administration's brutality, it's obvious that Trump is laying the foundation to do the exact same thing to American citizens. The only question is when. When is he going to kick it up a notch and take things to the next level and start sending Americans to gulags? And listen, I hate to say it, but at this point, the Constitution is just no longer in effect. The protections that we've been enjoying from the Constitution are no longer guaranteed to us because of this administration. They are destroying this country and destroying our entire system of laws and norms and gaslighting us while they do it, lying to our faces at every step of the way, telling us to not believe what we're seeing with our own eyes. I mean, this is quintessential fascism, and everyone has an obligation to condemn what's happening now while you still can, because in the near future, you might get disappeared if you speak out.